This is John Howell Essential Cuts, your daily rundown of the best from today's show on 890 WLS.
Stephen Portnoy works for ABC News. He's standing by in D.C. Today, a D.C. district judge, she ordered Trump's 2020 election interference trial to begin March 4th of next year. Special counsel Jack Smith wanted to take him to trial by January 2nd on the grounds that that date would vindicate the public's strong interest in a speedy trial. Trump's lawyers, of course, requested that the trial be pushed back 2.5 years to April of 2026. Now let's start with Stephen, who joins us here on the Big 89. Stephen, how did the judge justify this date in particular?
Well, she didn't really offer much of a justification except to say that she said it was in the interest of justice. She rejected the January 2nd date and pushed it back about 2 months. And the former president is saying on a social media platform he's going to try to appeal that decision. Very interesting to see if he follows through with that and to what extent the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which would be the next step that you would take it to, whether they see the former president's point on this. But one of the things that his attorneys forcefully argued today is that when you have more than 12 million pages of discovery material that the prosecution has provided, their argument is that they're not going to be positioned to provide the former president with an effective defense by having a trial starting anytime next year, or even, they argued, the year after that. They asked for a trial date of April 2026, more than 2.5 years from now. And the judge, Tanya Chutkin, rejected that out of hand. She said, we're not starting this trial in 2026. You're not getting 2 years. But she's giving them 6 months, and she says that is, that the former president has more resources than the average defendant, and that the prosecution has provided a more expedited discovery than most defendants would expect to get. And she says it's in the interest of justice for this to happen 6 months from now. So that's when jury selection will begin. March 4th, 2024, the day before the Super Tuesday primaries in more than a dozen states, and 3 weeks before another Trump criminal case, this one in New York State, involving the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels. That's set to start on the 25th of March.
The description of the material, the Tolstoy descriptor, is that accurate? I've heard a lot of people say, look, it's not as burdensome as it sounds, because it's really cut and dry to turn everything over to the defense attorney, sure, but there's a lot of duplicates in there, so on and so forth. Have you heard arguments that, hey, it's not actually that much?
Well, look, in terms of the math, I mean, you could fun with numbers, right? I think that the point that the prosecution tried to make today, in which they prevailed upon the court, was the fact that much of it is duplicative. Much of it comes from either Trump's campaign or his super PAC. One of the things the prosecutor said was that this is a lot of it stems from entities that were associated with the former president, such as the Secret Service. But the defense lawyer came back and said, wait a second, are you arguing that we should have spent the last several months digging through the National Archives, searching for material that might have played a role in this case? And the judge said, no, of course not. But, some of it comes from the January 6th committee. And all of that was publicly available. And so, look, the defense attorneys didn't get their way today. The former president is lashing out about it on social media, and there's a risk there. The more he says about the case on social media, the more he risks being sanctioned by this judge and perhaps other judges too. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Are they looking for exculpatory evidence? Obviously, is that what the indication was? Like they should have gone to the National Archives themselves?
Well, no, I think, look, he was trying to make a point. This is John Lauro, the Trump attorney, was trying to make a point that, the burden is on him now to prepare a defense for his client. He said he was only hired a month and a half ago. And how is he supposed to do a good job for his client with 12.8 million pages or whatever it is that has been thrust upon him? And the judge said, the former president of the United States has resources the average defendant doesn't have. And this is a matter that the former president, the defendant himself, was aware of nearly a year ago, that there was a grand jury, and he was represented by counsel then. And essentially, it's the defendant's rights, not so much the needs or capabilities of the defense lawyer, that appeared to be at issue. But what John Lauro said, as this was all winding down, is, Your Honor, with respect, he registered an objection. He said, I don't believe that we're going to be able to render effective counsel to our client. And that's probably going to be the basis for any appeal, this idea that it's just simply not possible for John Lauro and his co-counsel to do a good job given the math, given the enormity of it all in that kind of space and time. And he was very impassioned today. Yeah. He also said that he was going to bring multiple challenges to this case. He says he's going to file motions to dismiss. He's going to file a motion that says the former president was entitled to executive immunity, that because he was president of the United States, that nothing he did could possibly be subject to any kind of prosecutorial scrutiny. He's also going to file a motion that Donald Trump has been selectively prosecuted because the Biden administration is retaliating against him for things that Donald Trump has said about Hunter Biden.
I wish we could watch these proceedings. I think it'd be a good education for the country.
I completely agree, and I feel very fortunate to be able to have been a witness to it. I wish that we could bring everyone in.
Yeah. Has anybody pointed out the irony that our original inaugural date for president is March 4th?
Oh, thank you for the reminder. That I think that changed in 1933. Yeah. I don't remember what the amendment was, but it's been a while.
Yeah, March 4th was the original, in the Constitution. That was the date for the inauguration of the next president.
That's
somewhat
right.
Ironic. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Stephen Portnoy. Much appreciated, sir. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
Take care.
You're listening to John Howell, Essential Cuts on 890 WLS.
I read this in my Chicago Tribune. Risky business. Turning 40. Tom Cruise's Chicago-made movie has even more to say now about inequality and especially about the North Shore. Let's welcome the man that penned this, and we'll explain it, Christopher Borrelli. He is a columnist for the Tribune, whose subjects include, I love this bio, shadow puppet theater, acclaimed authors and cartoonists, Godzilla, and people who hoard copies of Jerry Maguire. Another Tom Cruise reference. Let's welcome Christopher back to the Big 89. Christopher, how are you, sir?
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much. I want to get to the Alice Cooper piece that I saw in today's Tribune as well, but let's start with Risky Business. And there's a connection between them. Risky Business, then and now, you wrote, is an indictment of privilege, white privilege, North Shore privilege. How so?
Well, I mean, it's kind of complicated. I mean, it's not obviously, well, I mean, here's the thing. It was made, when it was made, right, in the summer of really 82, it was made partly with this in mind. It was made by a guy named Paul Brickman, who was the director. He kind of, he kind of fell off the radar after Risky Business. He really didn't do very much after that. Initially, the movie was titled White Boys by the Lake, which is actually a line in the film. It was meant to sort of be sort of a snapshot of a country in the early Reagan years that was sort of seeing success as, sort of the most important thing, right? I mean, there's kind of a famous, I don't know if it's famous, but there's a scene in the movie. I don't know if you remember this, so when the last time you saw the movie, but there's a scene where I think a bunch of friends are sitting around and they're saying, like, what do you want to do after school? And somebody says, like, well, I want to help I think Tom Cruise says, I want to help my fellow man. And he's being kind of sarcastic. And they all say, well, I just want to make money. Yeah, I want to make a lot of money. And, it's kind of, it's a comedy, obviously. But the way the film deals with the way these kids kind of, they handle money on, essentially in Highland Park. And then they sort of snake off to the city. And then they kind of get into trouble and they kind of return to the city just to sort of have everything kind of cleaned up for them later. It's sort of, I mean, it's hard to explain a little bit because it's sort of like, if you've seen Ferris Bueller, it's, it's a light. Yeah. You don't really think about these things with Ferris Bueller, right?
So Brickman is kind of a dark John Hughes.
Yeah. I mean, very much so. I mean, it's sort of, the thing is that John Hughes is kind of intentionally making something of a fantasy. And the difference in Risky Business, although I guess it's fantasy in a lot of ways, is it really kind of reminds you that, at all the moments, particularly at the end, these kids can kind of return. They can get in any kind of trouble they want, but they can kind of return to sort of the comfort of where they are, no matter what. And the people that are sort of in their orbit really the people in the city, they can't. You know what I mean? They're sort of their future's a lot iffier. So the movie ends on a very kind of I mean, again, if you haven't seen it in a long time, I was sort of surprised how kind of cold the movie ends. And,
Could you see?
And I don't mean that. Yeah. Sorry.
This is a change in the subject, but I agree. It's been years since I've seen the movie, decades probably. But I remember the scene where he's Bob Seger, old time rock and roll. I remember that obviously. Actually emulated that in a show that I had a number of years ago, which was a huge mistake. Thank God that was before the cell phones cameras existed. But I noticed that Chicago embraces some movies, but doesn't embrace Risky Business. Why not?
I mean, I don't know. You'd have to ask Chicago, right?
Yeah.
But I would guess that it's not particularly flattering. You know what I mean? It's also not in the end very. It doesn't leave you with sort of a good feeling about the place in a way, like in the same way that say John Hughes movies did. Yeah. They're flattering movies, and this one really, in the end isn't particularly flattering. Again, I've had people send me letters since this piece ran that, it's just a light-hearted comedy. You're taking it too seriously. And I mean, maybe that's true, I suppose. But I think, anything, piece of art, whatever it is, things last for a reason. And when they speak, past their own years, a lot of times it's because it speaks to a different time sometimes, and I think, to see it again is to really kind of get a snapshot I wrote this in the piece. It's very much so to kind of get a snapshot of what inequality looks like.
I'd like to go back and watch these movies just to see, either the Chicago movies, like it was the 40th anniversary of The Fugitive recently. I want to go back and watch that to see what the city looked like 40 years ago. What's that?
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of anniversaries right now.
Right. And similarly, I haven't seen Risky Business. I don't think I've seen it since it came out, to be honest with you. But I want to go on to the other piece, which caught my eye today. I didn't meet him. I mean, I didn't spend any time with him. But years ago, I was at a White Sox game at the Old Park. I think it was the Old Park, sure. And right across the aisle from me, with his long hair up under a ball cap, trying to stay incognito, was the huge baseball fan and scratch golfer, my understanding, Alice Cooper. Right. But it wasn't until I read your piece today that I realized he lived in Lake Point Towers for a couple of years when he came to Chicago to dry out, essentially. And who else was living there while he was filming Risky Business? Tom Cruise. Tell us the story. How did you wind up interviewing Alice Cooper? That was a very interesting interview with him.
I just, I've always been a huge Alice Cooper fan. I mean, I'm the age, right? I'm the right age, and I just noticed he was playing in Tinley Park, so I mentioned to my editor, it'd be kind of interesting to, just do a quick interview with him and really kind of, in some ways, clear up some of the things I've always heard about him. You know what I mean? He's 70. He just turned 75. He seems very willing to always kind of, in a way, like talk about the rumors, talk about the things that you've heard about him, like that he killed the chicken on stage and all these things that had kind of like passed into like rock lore, right? So yeah, I mean, I remember years ago somebody telling me Alice Cooper lives in that building and he lives next door to Oprah. That's not true, but the Tom Cruise thing I didn't know about.
Yeah. The other thing that came from that article, and if you can elaborate on this, Alice Cooper, who was a shock entertainer back in those days, he thinks that's virtually impossible now because we've seen everything. We no longer have the ability to be shocked, whether it's politically, through artwork, through movies, through music, through anything. Forget it. We've seen it all, and we have a callous on us now as far as the ability to be shocked.
That's right. I mean, it's very hard. It's funny. It's like to see him today. I mean, he does some of the same stage tricks that he did then, but in some ways, it's more out of nostalgia in some sense. I mean, people forget, and it's very hard to probably explain to people that, when you were sort of cutting babies up, fake dolls on stage, in 1972 or 1973, it was kind of, unsettling to people. And, it might have been a little bit of a shtick, but it was like, whoa, these guys are coming out. They're often in women's clothing. They're covered in blood. What is this about? None of that sounds particularly insane now. You know what I mean? But back then it was very, it was, in many ways, he's the precursor to, well, he's definitely the precursor to Kiss, but he's also in many ways the precursor to David Bowie too, who kind of, and I mentioned this in the piece, who saw Alice Cooper early on and said, okay, I want something I want my own stage presence to be a little bit more theatrical. You know what I mean? So as far as shocking people goes, though, he said there's no way to shock anyone anymore. In fact, he said to me, the thing that shocks him the most is how blind people are to school shootings.
Yeah. So here we go again today.
He was very, exactly. Yeah. So he's, the shock's gone, but the funny thing is the shock might be gone, but a lot of his music is really, really good still. I don't know if you like it, but I was a big fan, and I think I still really like him a lot.
Yeah, it's tough to look at, artwork from 40 years ago through contemporary eyeglasses because, as you wrote back to Risky Business, a lot of what would be considered to be, just humorous 40 years ago are considered now to be micro or macro aggressions.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and similarly to Alice Cooper, Well, I enjoy your writing. I wish you'd write more for the Tribune. You're probably limited. They probably can't pay you for more work.
No, I'm a staff writer. I write every week. I'm there. They pay me no matter what. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I enjoy it, and I thought that was an interesting little connection. When Alice Cooper met Tom Cruise in their apartment building together, they're both renting condos, what did he tell Tom Cruise?
He said, good luck, basically. I hope you do well, And it just kind of cracks him up, essentially, now that he's told Tom Cruise early on in his career that, I hope you do okay, and I think he did okay. So
both those guys, I think they did okay. Christopher, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it, sir. Have a great day.
All right, thank you. You too.
Take care. Christopher Borrelli from the Tribune.
Portia, there is no substitute. You. Well, do I?
What do you think?
I don't know. You tell me. Yes, no, maybe.
Yeah, he's done pretty well for himself.
This is John Howell, Essential Cuts on 890 WLS.
Reading from Crain, Chicago Business. Fermilab is building a new accelerator that eventually will be used to shoot a beam of particles underground from a research lab in the western suburbs, Batavia, all the way to a former gold mine in South Dakota in an effort to answer one of the biggest questions in physics. How did we get here? To answer that question, apparently, they're going to use an elaborate experiment, including a lot of people who are participating. Let's start there with John Pletz, senior reporter covering technology, aviation, and cannabis. Never those streams shall meet, I hope. For Crain Chicago Business. John, welcome back. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. So when does this happen?
It happens over time, over several years. They got to build pretty much everything they need for this experiment from scratch. Everything from digging big holes in the ground in South Dakota to building the equipment that goes inside of it. So it is not a quick process, and then the experiment itself could run a couple of decades.
So it's a $4 billion project, 1,400 collaborators, 30 different countries involved. Who's in charge?
The folks at Fermi are kind of directing this orchestra, but there's a lot of different players. There's folks in other countries as well who are orchestrating those efforts.
Why is Fermilab kind of largely overlooked by the public here in Chicago?
The national labs are sort of out off on their own, and unless you're a scientist, you generally don't have a lot of contact with it. So most people kind of forget that they're there. Occasionally they pop up in the news for things like this, but largely they just kind of go overlooked. Well,
try to explain to us, the layman here, exactly what will this Dune project how will it bring us closer to the question, how did we get here, the Big Bang?
Well, they're trying to figure out basically why there ended up being more antimatter than matter. And this tiny little particle called a neutrino can sort of change form over time. And if that really is what happened, that may go a long way to explaining why did we get that little imbalance that ended up, allowing us to be here.
Bill Bryson has a book called A Short History of Almost Everything. I think that's the name of the title, but he tries to explain in layman's terms the Big Bang. Now, we've had a smaller project, a smaller dune experiment called NOVA. We've already done this from Batavia to Ash River, Minnesota. Is that just too short of a distance for this project?
Yeah, I mean, these projects happen over time. You have an idea, and you try an experiment. And that kind of says, well, you're on the right track. But it doesn't really get you all the way there. And the previous experiment got them far enough there to say, let's spend a few $1 billion trying to prove this out. But what happens with, and it's true with this and a lot of other fields, is you're doing a lot of math to model and estimate things. And so the distance that is involved between here in South Dakota versus here in Minnesota is one in which they think they have the best of their best possibility of seeing that sort of change in state of the neutrinos, and that's why they're doing it.
The $4 billion project, who's primarily funding this?
Mostly the Department of Energy, and that Fermi and Argonne are largely DOE labs. Is
the information ours as far as our property, or do we have to share it with the other 30 countries that are involved?
I don't know. I suspect that with all of those things, you're trying to figure things out, and exactly who has ownership of it, I don't know.
Is this, obviously you wrote about it in Crain's, but John, is this somewhat top secret?
Oh, I don't think so. It's like the search for the Higgs boson, the God particle a few years ago at CERN. The lab in Europe. Everybody sort of knows what you're doing and what you're trying to do, and you want everybody to know that because you want to make sure it's right. It's a big experiment. It takes a lot of people, a lot of equipment, a lot of expertise, and so that's what they're doing.
John Pletz is here. He's senior reporter covering technology for Crain Chicago Business. When Enrico Fermi, during the Manhattan Project, at that squash court, or I guess under the squash court, at the University of Chicago, when he pulled the rods out of the pile, they weren't quite sure what was going to happen. Are they pretty sure that this experiment stays on track and doesn't have any sort of potential of wiping out humanity as we know it?
Yeah, the neutrinos, are unlikely to bother anything, which is why they're great to study. They don't often interact with things, which makes them hard to study, but the likelihood of something going awry is pretty minimal.
I understand the track at Fermilab in Batavia. I get that, and pardon my ignorance here, but how do the particles get from here out to the old gold mine in South Dakota?
They literally just get blasted through the ground, and they travel to a detector on the other side. So that's one of the great things about it. You're not having to build a tube from here to South Dakota.
Okay. Well, I was somewhat hesitant to ask that stupid of a question, but as somebody once said, there's no stupid questions, just stupid answers, right?
Indeed, absolutely correct.
So this could take years and years and years. Will you be writing the follow-up for sure to this when they finally conclusively determine how do we get here?
I have no idea. Depends on how long it takes.
Yeah. How many people did you interview for this piece?
Oh, probably not much more than a half dozen or so. But some really, really smart people who were very, very patient and willing to take the time to explain it to a non-physicist like me.
And Sanford's involved in this, right? The underground research facility, that's in South Dakota.
Yeah, that's the that was a the partner with Fermi.
Okay. Yeah, not Stanford, but Sanford, correct?
Yes,
Yep.
absolutely right.
I've read about them previously. All right, well, I guess so we don't have to worry about bad things happening, so fine, go ahead. Maybe we can determine how the Big Bang actually happened, a little spark of energy that started it all.
Yes.
What do you find most interesting about writing this piece?
Not only what they were trying to do, but what goes into trying to prove it. Just the amount of time and effort. They've already spent way more than a decade just getting to this point. I mean, it's just sort of stunning, and that's why I guess we have the national labs, because who else is going to try something like this, and that's what makes it interesting.
And you're pretty convinced that the Department of Energy is doing the $4 billion project with no military thoughts in mind.
Oh, I have no idea. The Department of Energy, does a lot of things, a lot of basic research, and it just so happens that a lot of that happens here in Chicago. But yeah, it's just one of the federal agencies that spends money trying to figure out big things, and you often stumble across a lot of other things along the way, which is one of the values of the national labs, as well as university labs, doing basic research.
Are you familiar with the book The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis?
Only in passing.
I've
not had a chance to read it.
There's a big chapter in there on the Department of Energy. I recommend the book, but I especially recommend that chapter. Once you read it, you'll never forget it.
Okay.
Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. I read everything you write in Crain Chicago Business, and John Pletz will have you back. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, John.
Take care.
You're listening to John Howell, Essential Cuts on 890 WLS.
Cable news shows and networks finally have been ranked for bias and accuracy. Of course, I can't vouch for the outfit that is doing this, but I'll pass it on, and if you'd like to look at it, you can do so. We've also requested, that Rachel has a request out to the CEO of this outfit to join us to explain her methodology on this. But questions related to bias, objectivity, accuracy in news hang over every media outlet and journalist. Well, not everyone. I mean, Kim's job is to, get it right. My job is just to get it on. I don't lose sleep at night about that. Anyway, that's nothing new. Understanding which news sources are reliable and in which direction they lean has become an increasingly daunting task. A Colorado startup called Ad Fontes, meaning to the sources in Latin, of course you knew that already, recently raised $4.2 million in a first round of financing, and they believe they can help answer the questions with its media bias chart, which you can take a look at, I think for free. The chart rates broadcasters, shows, publications on two separate criteria, reliability and bias. Reliability is charted 0 to 64. Anything over 40 is very reliable, like the information is actually accurate. Sun comes up in the east, sets in the west. And there's some news outlets that would report that, no, that's fake. Sun comes up in the west and it sets in the east. And by God, we're dying on that hill. Okay, so this charts reliability. And then also a separate criteria on how biased it is, either to the left or to the right. Okay? How far away from zero cable news channels, cable news hosts, cable shows, radio shows are veering off the middle. 0 being purely balanced. Okay? Minus 42 being most extreme left, plus 42 being most extreme right. Okay? So when looking at the 5 top cable news networks, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, Newsmax, and News Nation, CNN and News Nation lead the pack in reliability. They're both right there at 40. MSNBC comes in third at 31. Fox has 26. Newsmax is in the propaganda category with only a 15 rating. Okay, you can read more if you want about the cable news channels themselves. So as I mentioned, the founder, Vanessa Otero, we've reached out to her, and we're going to try to get her on the program this week. She goes through, if you want to read the piece, we'll put it up on our social media sites. She goes through her methodology. Then you go to cable news shows, and I'll just give you the famous names. Fox and Friends comes in at a 30 for reliability. They are hyper-partisan right for bias, however. Similarly, Morning Joe is reliable, the most reliable of the top 3 cable news morning shows. He's near 40, but he's strong left territory for bias. Fox's Hannity, a reliability rating of only 19%, or 19. These aren't percent. These are just numbers. 19. That's in the propaganda territory. Rachel Maddow, who seems to my ear to be as far left as Hannity is right, she gets a reliability rating of 36, though. Here we go. Overall, the top 3 cable news networks, out of all of them, Brett Baer's special report landed as the most reliable program. Brett's at 45.33 rating, skewing right at a 9. As far as the mainstream media evening news outlets, Nora O'Donnell, Lester Holt, and David Muir all rated just above Baer in that order as the most reliable news broadcasts in the U.S. So you can read more if you want. I found this truncated version and some crosstabs at Mediaite.com. Mediaite.com.
John Howell, Essential Cuts. Check back every weekday for another episode of John Howell, Essential Cuts on 890 WLS.